Hi, welcome to this McGraw-Hill Education Learning Conference. I'm Lindsay Root with McGraw-Hill Education, and I will be the webinar moderator for today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This event is being presented in listen-only mode, which means you will be able to hear the presenter, but they won't be able to hear you. However, that doesn't mean you can't participate. There will be polling questions throughout the presentation, and we will hold all questions until the end, and you're welcome to type them in the Q&A panel on your screen throughout the entire session. Joining us today is Dr. Mark Shinn. Mark's session titled Proactive Design and Implementation of Multi-Tiered Services will focus on implementing academic and behavior support interventions in all of your classrooms K through 12. Dr. Mark Shinn is a professor of school psychology at National Louis University and focuses on functional educational assessment, including progress monitoring and screening response for intervention. I'd now like to turn the session over to Mark. Mark, good morning.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone else, wherever you may be. My name is Mark, and I'll be taking you through a really fast tour of how lessons learned, really, in terms of building multi-tiered systems of supports or response intervention to be able to support teachers and make the job of teaching easier and increasing student achievement for all kids. Now, if you don't mind, I am nearsighted, and I'm going to take my glasses off. So let's begin. Okay, title page. There'll be a set of handouts and some readings that I'll be able to direct you to here shortly. If you have the handouts, I did identify 4 really important slides for you to take a look at, mostly because there's a lot of detail on them, and it'll capture about 35 years of lessons learned. But let's begin. Okay, I think you learned a little bit about my credentials. I'm a school psychologist by training, although most people wouldn't know it when they hear me talk. I've been working a long time, 43 different states, supporting them in their implementation of multi-tiered system of supports, screening and progress monitoring of basic skills. And so I'm going to take a pretty serious basic skills focus in my illustrations today, but it won't be the sole content of what we need to be able to do for tiered services, as you will see. So when you download the more extensive handouts, you'll be able to see that I do have at least a few street creds for having a reasonable voice in this process. You'll also see a disclosure statement. I think transparency is really important. If you're doing good work, I think people want to make money, and I have no issues around people doing that as long as they're transparent. Read the disclosure statement, and you'll see that I've been working for various people over the years. The things I'll be talking about today, I have no financial interest in, and you should also know that nobody screens my slides, tells me what to say, or tells me what not to say, and I like that when I do my work. Okay, so this is just going to be Mark's opinions about lessons learned in proactive design to support teachers. Now, if you take just a second and you find my website, markshinn.org, you will see I've prepared a bunch of things for you to read. Okay, more things than you could possibly read in 2 to 3 months. There's some instructions in the handouts. If you just really follow the simple ideas and just start with that, where that circle is up there, that ellipse that says resources and downloads, then just go and everything will be self-explanatory. You'll get into a bunch of folders that are alphabetical, and it's really pretty straightforward. Okay, what you'll be looking for is the McGraw-Hill Education Virtual Summit folder. In there, there'll be a copy of the handouts. There will be 1 per slide, 4 slides per page, and then a folder called Elementary Implementation or Elementary Interventions, and then a folder called Secondary Interventions. So read to your heart's delight. I've accumulated a number of things that people have found very, very helpful, and I'll ask you to do personal use only. Okay, so let's take a trip back in time if we can. Okay, so remember these days when every problem was a special education problem? I mean, it was amazing that if a kid was a little crooked, let's refer him to special ed. If a kid was really significantly discrepant in their basic skills. Let's refer them for special ed. And when we did this, we were driven by teacher referral. Okay, remember those days? Now here's what we also learned, that some teachers referred, some teachers didn't refer. So if you got with the right teacher, you might get help. If you got with the wrong teacher, you might not. Okay, somebody just popped down the phone there. Okay, so here's what we also learned in those good old days. The typical age for special ed intervention was grades 3 or 4, long after kids had established a pattern of failure. That can't be good. When we did refer in 3rd or 4th grade, we tested the living daylights out of kids. We had really long meetings, and we focused on what a kid had. We spent very little time on the intervention the kid would actually receive, and pretty much everyone that was referred, everyone that was tested, pretty much everyone was eligible. Now, some kids weren't eligible when they were young. They weren't least eligible as specific learning disabilities, so they got what I would call the runner-up prize. They got language impaired, which of course then we got them the kinds of services that really weren't going to remediate a reading problem, and certainly really weren't sufficiently powerful enough to solve a serious language problem. But we persisted. So once kids got in special ed, the other thing we learned in those good old days is once they got in, they never got out. So people knew that there was a lot of dissatisfaction, the system wasn't working very well, right? So we moved on to a new process called pre-referral intervention. Remember those days? In those days, we changed our thinking a little bit. The idea was not every problem was a special ed problem, but we were still driven by referral, and that meant some teachers referred, some teachers didn't, some kids got support, some kids didn't. But here's what we did. We asked teachers to think up stuff to do. And I called them the 2 magical things that they had to do before we referred for special education. Then, when that didn't work, and that's not surprising, we're asking teachers to do a lot. The referrals came to a school team to problem solve, and we did it again. Okay? We came up with another intervention, and after all that, guess what we did? We referred, we tested, we placed, we had long meetings focused on what a kid had and not necessarily what a kid needed. Okay, so more than a decade ago now, we shifted and we said we need to be preventive, we need to be proactive, we need to understand that we need to do things like adjust our core program to meet the needs of more kids. Our core program should meet the needs of most. But no matter how great our school system is, there will be some kids who need more. And no matter how great our remedial services might be for below average kids, there are going to be some kids that need really intensive services. This was a great figure, a really great figure. It says academics and behavior go hand in glove. Perfect, absolutely, great. Now the numbers kind of bother me because those were just some kind of ideal pipe dream. And I think they've taken on a life of their own, and I just encourage you to rethink some of that. But the bottom line, when we ended up in this process, and my slide is not advancing. And my slide is, there we go. What we ended up doing, that we still had this pre-referral model, okay? Pre-referral model is kids had to come to a team. Every referral had to come to a building team, a building assistance team, a student support team, pick your name, okay? And in that process, we problem solved. We had to have a problem identification, problem analysis, problem solution, all that sort of stuff. And when that didn't work, guess what we did? The kid then went to, I think, if the slide loads, went to tier 2. And guess what we did? We started all over again. We met, we talked, we planned, we implemented, and when that didn't work, guess what happened? The kid would move into a tier 3 intervention. In that tier intervention, we would do the same process. We would problem identification, problem analysis, intervention plan, progress monitor, and sooner or later, and I mean sooner or later, after lots of meeting, lots of time, too often, we'd end up with the same old system, which was, after failing in tier 2, after failing in tier 3, we referred, we tested, we placed. And that model is just a little bit of a variation of pre-referral intervention, which was a little bit of a variation on how we've done business for 35 years. Good tiered services, good multi-tiered systems of supports are not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. We're trying to actually think differently. We're trying to actually intervene differently. And so here's some of our big ideas. When we do RTI, my observations has been it's been very, very little different. It's been focused on that referral process, individually designed interventions, and after all said and done, the school develops interventions one kid at a time. Very, very reactive. Oh, and by the way, when I see a lot of tiered services, we tend to ignore the core or tier 1 instruction. We take that as, I would argue, sacrosanct and can't be touched because it's always going to be problem solved at tiers 2 and tiers 3. That's not a very viable model, right? When we think in 2015 about high quality tiered services or RTI, we design it proactively. What we actually do is figure out what groups of kids need. So what do our below average students struggle with in reading? What do our significantly discrepant, well below average students struggle with in mathematics? What do we do for at-risk kids in writing or kids with intensive needs in writing? What are our behavior supports for kids who need a little? And what are our behavior supports for kids who need a lot? What do we do at the core, at the level of the school and the classroom for prevention and promotion? That's proactive design. And lessons learned will be this. If we're going to improve teacher outcomes and teacher supports, is we have to intervene early and powerfully and with proven programs. I'm going to take you through in about a half hour about all of those things in a really short period of time. Okay? But let's start with this one. This is a 4th grade student, and the student's going to read aloud using a set of tools that have been research-based for more than 35 years, variations of curriculum-based measurement. This is an oral reading test that we can listen to a kid read under standard conditions and judge how well he reads.
If you come to a word that you don't know, I'll tell it to you. Be sure you do your best reading. Are there any questions? No. Okay, begin. It's a pretty good competition. I feel it.
When I say begin, start reading aloud at the top of the page. Read across the page. Try to read each word. If you come to a word that you don't know, I'll tell it to you. Be sure to do your best reading. Are there any questions?
Start reading out.
Okay, begin.
It's a pretty good competition. The book I felt it probably knowing it was a best one at my school.
Ouch, I can't take it anymore, even though it's a minute. What intervention would a student like this receive? Now, this student in most communities would be in the bottom 10%. This is a student who reads about 52, 53 words a minute correctly, and this is a student who reads with about 70% accuracy. Little understanding, very few qualitative features. So let's take a look. How would your process at elementary or even middle school begin? This is an online poll, and I'd like to see some of your answers. Your choices are teacher referral with whatever the teacher's got, teacher referral with consistent and valid universal screening data, or it's actually no referral, and the teachers examine all of the universal screening data, identify kids for tier 2, or the team looks at all of your universal screen data and you triage. A kid who's below average might be in a tier 2 intervention. Kids who are significantly discrepant might be in, based on those cut scores, yellow, red, and green, those kids might be triaged. Or do you triage into proportional interventions, like kids in your bottom quarter, consider tier 2, kids in your bottom 10%, consider tier 3. Is it haphazard? It depends on which school you're in. Or your bottom line is, beats me. Now, I'm presuming that when I go to the next page, you don't have to do this. A value must be, I guess I've got to provide. Okay, so I'm going to make my choice, but it need not be yours. Let's see what we get. Oh my goodness, Mark, your slides are not progressing through the keyboard. You have to highlight them in the right navigation. Are you kidding me? I swear I've been hitting those things. I should be on the polling results slide. And the polling results are not showing up on the screen. Okay. I don't know if it's a fixed time frame where people respond. I think I'm the guinea pig as part of being the keynote. So my apologies for any technical issues. Okay, I'm going to try to go to the next slide because here's how I would prefer that we do it. I'm not seeing any slides, gang. And I'm getting really hot. Are we hung up at the level of the poll? Is that what the issue is? Because I'm not hearing anything from anybody. My slides are not advanced. I have no slides on my screen. Okay, the results are displaying now, so maybe if I go back. Gang, I'm hit the red play button. I have hit the red play button. They're green. I slide over it and it's green. Sorry everyone, refresh your browser.
Webcam is back up now.
Okay, so my apologies for the technical difficulties. Okay, I'm not able to advance my slides with the previous and next buttons in the upper left. You should be able to see the first slide, and maybe this will come live as I can't advance. Oh, say next and we will advance for you. Next. Okay, now it's popped up. I would prefer that at the elementary and middle school level, we actually triage based on our available resources. Billy's score is the score of that blue dot, okay? And the green box would be the performance of average kids. The orange line would be scores of kids in the bottom quarter. And conversely, the blue line would be kids in above average, the upper quarter. Above that blue line would be kids in our top 10%. Below that orange line would be kids in our bottom 10%. I would prefer that, given Billy's performance is in the bottom 10%, that the grade level team looks at these data and says, Billy's a good candidate for Tier 3 intervention. Now, I wouldn't just use this data alone. I think teacher judgments and professional judgments are really important. But proactive design would look at every kid's needs, taking referral out of the process, having the teacher be part of the screening team, and we would triage students into appropriately tiered interventions. Now, when we look at triaging students into appropriately tiered interventions, when we do it with grade level support, and that means grade level teams with the administrators, preferably with any support personnel like tiered services providers, looking at the data, we would make these decisions. And I would actually encourage us to use our end of the year data to triage students' intervention for the next year. So we use our end of the year data as the most important screening data after the beginning of kindergarten. We can always screen move-in kids in the fall, but we would like to have proactive design done for most of the kids before the year even begins, so they can get intervention from the very first day. Now, how would interventions be determined? And I'm hoping I can skip through these slides to be able to get to the part of the presentation, since somewhere the slides goofed it up. When we talk about what kind of interventions, would a team design an intervention student by student and somebody else delivers it? Does the team assign the student to interventions that have been chosen because they're research-based? It varies school to school. Or the teams, the last question shouldn't be there. My bias is this: the team would triage students into appropriately selected intervention that they have been chosen because they're research-based. Okay, so here's my perspective on a student like Billy. I would prefer that Billy is triaged into a Tier 3 appropriately intensive intervention using a standard proven comprehensive reading program, preferably at least 60 minutes a day, okay, or more. My bias would be that this intervention program would have a strong vocabulary component, and if it's not embedded in the comprehensive program, we supplement it with another proven program. My bias is this: this kid probably is going to need a behavior support plan, because most kids who are struggling in academically also have issues around effort and motivation. I would hope that in addition to the proven program, that this student would have sufficient opportunity for guided, or my preferred term, coached reading of materials of suitable difficulty, where the student can actually get corrective feedback. This kid's going to need a lot of practice doing things right and doing things well. The student is also going to have to read really well inside and outside of school. He's going to have to read a lot. And I'm going to monitor progress weekly with a type of measurement called curriculum-based measurement that I can measure weekly with a goal that reduces the performance gap. I'm getting some strange echo outside my house. I'm also going to consider a language arts assessment, because if this student has a significant spelling discrepancy, and I would predict that that student does, that student would get an additional spelling component to the intervention. All right. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a struggling secondary student. Okay? This is an 11th grade student who does not navigate grade 7 material very well. So I'm going to skip over the video. What would a struggling reader receive in your high school in terms of tiered intervention? In terms of tiered interventions, we know that middle school is behind elementary level. We know that high school is behind middle school. We're not as sophisticated yet, but I'm going to say that's good news, because now we can start to do it right. For a student in high school, the question shifts. We still use screening data, but what we do is we screen not universally after 9th grade. We screen individually. Historically, the problem begins with kids in content area classrooms. They're struggling in social studies, but we're not going to determine their intervention needs based on social studies. We're going to base it upon whether they need an intensive basic skill intervention. If a student is significantly discrepant from, say, an end of grade 7 standard in high school, we're going to provide that student intensive basic skills tier 3 intervention. The challenge for us in terms of tiered services at a high school is this. There are a number of students who have low-level basic skills, and we've tried to solve this problem the wrong way. If kids have low-level basic skills, we have to do something dramatically different. And that dramatic different is trying to provide content area support. Now the good news is we've got 35, 40 years of research in the field of general and special education about how to support lower performing kids in content area classrooms. And we could talk about the content learning continuum, we could talk about, and these are all variations of the University of Kansas strategic instruction model. But in high school, our proactive design requires us to think and differentiate the kids that we treat with intensive basic skill intervention or the kids that we support with content, things like content area literacy and equivalent in mathematics. Okay, now, proactive design. If we were going to cut to the chase, this is what it would look like. At a high school, I'm going to establish a minimum basic skill proficiency. And let's say I wanted any student who was below an end of 7th grade reading standard to be a potential target for intervention. This is that 11th grade student's score compared to the performance of end of the year 7th graders. The green box is the scores of end of the year typically achieving 7th graders. That's how well 7th graders read. That orange line would be kids in the bottom quarter of end of the year 7th graders, and that below that orange line would be kids in the bottom 10% of end of the year 7th graders. This 11th grader, it would be below the 10th percentile if they were in 7th grade. And this student needs an appropriately intensive tier 3 intervention. So again, we take the concept of triage, identifying a minimum basic skill proficiency. We would triage students who are below average into appropriate intervention, and then we would provide intervention programs. Okay, so here's what we typically do. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the polls. Okay, in most circumstances in high school, we're going to see one of the first two options being the most popular. Help with homework probably being number one. Help with homework or tutoring is a decidedly weak intervention that's been observed for more than 30 years. It doesn't tend to improve content area instruction. Remember, these are kids that are significantly discrepant. And it doesn't provide them the strategies that they need to help them in all their content area classrooms. The second most common is we give kids extended time, which I make jokes about, that we give kids longer time to do something they can't do. Or we modify grades or lower expectations. We could do co-teaching with a special educator in the classroom, and unless that person has a specific mission, I don't think that that's a good option either. What would I do? What would be my choices? My choices would be this. Again, if I'm going to have an intensive basic skill intervention, I would prefer that this student, and I know this is going to be a challenge for those of you at the high school level, but remember, we tend to pass on problems rather than solve them. I would much rather do this at grade 9 than grade 11. But if we intervene, my theme has been to intervene intensely and powerfully using proven programs, okay? And I would use, with this student, an intensive, comprehensive, Tier 3 delivered, research-based language arts program. With careful attention, since this student, if you heard this student read, is struggling with multisyllabic words and word knowledge, this student is going to need a program that includes vocabulary, comprehension strategies, some writing, and that's going to have to be at least 75 minutes a day. Remember, I'd much rather intervene at middle school than high school. I'd much rather intervene at elementary than middle school. But if I've got a student who's significantly discrepant at high school, I need to stop the high school dropout to prison pipeline. Kids who fail to learn to read are incredibly high candidates for dropping out. Kids who drop out are incredibly high candidates for things like prison, low employment, and all kinds of undesirable outcomes. What else would go into this program? Well, you're going to see some things much like I would do at the elementary level. Okay? The behavior support plan is probably going to be an additional component. Probably the notion would be guided reading, but now we need to shift to a different kind of text to read. This student is going to need corrective feedback and practice navigating narrative and critically informational text. Once we get into middle school and high school, our focus has to be on stuff that communicates knowledge. When we look at an intervention component, this student is going to have additional reading inside and outside of school. We need to turn this student on into the things that can be gained from informational text. The student's got to read a lot of it. If we're building a system proactively, the student is going to have progress monitored weekly, and that goal's got to reduce the gap. And if our program is not reducing the gap, we need to increase the intervention intensity. And then in the student's other content area classrooms, this intervention actually has to have a component of general ed teaching practice that enhance content learning. Okay? And that means for all students. What we've learned at the high school level and middle school level is the notion of a rising tide raises all boats. There are things that content area teachers could learn, should learn, that increases achievement, not just for that significantly discrepant student, but for low achieving, for typically achieving, and yes, even high achieving students. And we tend not to have those in teachers' repertoires, not because teachers are not interested, but because their teacher preparation programs don't deliver that information. Okay, so in working with schools for more than 30 years and helping them design proactively an intervention system that meets the needs of more kids and is easier for teachers to deliver than the old kind of pre-referral intervention, I asked people, if you were going to design it, what would you put on your blank pieces of paper? I mean, if we go out and buy a house, we don't just say, well, we're going to buy a better house than we've got right now. We'd probably have some design features. Well, we want a house with X number of bedrooms, or X numbers of bathrooms, or a basement that we can use as a rec room for our kids, or 2-car garage, or a 1-car garage, or a garage doesn't matter to us at all. We'd have a bunch of things that we would look at. And unfortunately, when I see schools, they take probably what I would call the superficial trappings of tiered interventions. Well, we have to have tiers, and we have to have screening, and then what do we do? So I think it's sort of helpful to have some idea about what it might look like if we built it. And so what I'm going to do in the remaining 10 minutes is I'm going to give you a very quick tour from the things that I think is sort of important, not with the idea that this is your plan, but is a plan to be able to compare and contrast. And I'll do one for elementary and I'll do one for secondary. And again, we can address some of these things if they strike you. And these are the 4 handouts that I prioritize because they're bigger and you can see the whole thing. Okay, the elementary pathway. The very first place I begin is ensuring that I've got a safe environment conducive for student learning. And that means I need some variation of school-wide behavior support at the level of the school. I need to be able to see that behavior support extended into the classroom, and I need those principles of saying, let's say, be respectful, or being safe, or being ready to learn, not only at the school, not only at the class, but also across tiers. If I've got that in place, teaching is easier, student learning is increased. I need to ensure that I've got a core language arts program that's research-based and sufficiently intensive to meet the needs of students. Not what the adults like, but the intensity of program that a kid needs. And I'm not a fan of building our own curriculum. We need to have powerful, explicit language instruction. The key concept is academic language, not conversational language, but academic English taught early and explicitly. And I need to see how I'm doing that. In my school at the elementary level, I got to turn kids on to reading. I need to make reading volume a priority and get kids to read widely. That's got to be a component of proactive design. I need to ensure that all kids can write their letters, numbers, and words without pain and without thinking. And I would add that at a certain point, I would like to ensure that all students can keyboard letters, numbers, and words without pain and without thinking. If a student is trying to figure out how to write the letter A or write the word alphabet, they're not going to be thinking about using writing as a tool to communicate. And we tend to underplay these important tool skills. Okay, I need a data system that's simple and easy. Look, I can screen a kid with 40 to 60 minutes on a computer, but when I multiply that amount of time by kids, that's an awful lot of time to find kids who can't read or can't do math. I can screen a kid in reading in 5 minutes and be able to triage with authentic measures that are also useful for progress monitoring. This is a family of measurement called curriculum-based measurement. Now remember, I like technology, except when it doesn't work. So let's continue. I'm going to use my end of the year screening data to triage students into appropriately Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions. So next year's teachers know what kids are getting what intervention from the very first week of school. Okay, those are my first 7. What's number 8? We need to reduce the amount of testing, especially testing for diagnosis or instructional planning. We have this notion that if we give teachers a ton of information, they will use it to plan individualized interventions for the 28 to 32 or 22 kids in the classroom. I would much rather spend that time having good programming and good coaching and good staff development in delivering the curriculum than testing the living daylights out of all kids. I want to ensure that if we have Tier 3 and in special education, we are doing incredibly high quality intensive intervention and monitoring progress the right way. Our Tier 2 needs to be coordinated. By that I mean if I've got Title I and reading specialists, I'm going to ask them to say kumbaya, shake hands, and say we're going to coordinate our services and provide Tier 2 so general ed core instruction teachers don't have to do the core and Tier 2 as well. And I'm going to change this is going to sound sort of weird, but if I'm going to expedite tiered services, I need to change my special ed eligibility process. It's the wrong way to get significant change, but we're not going to get anywhere by sorting kids based on ability achievement or cognitive patterns of strengths and weaknesses. For those of you in special ed, you know what I'm saying. We're going to change our IEP goals and progress monitoring. This is my blank sheet. These are the things that I've seen really make a difference. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to take my school psychologists, social workers if I've got them, speech and language clinicians, and they're going to hardly do any testing. And they are going to be my consultation and coaching support for academics and or behavior. Now that's my vision for what it would look like at an elementary level. And what would it look like at a secondary level? Proactive design at a secondary level will look like this. I'm going to commit to, guess what? School-wide behavior support. But I need to add the dimensions of being able to address tardies, detention, and suspension. And we've got a pretty extensive research base about strategies that can improve all of these outcomes in a positive and more effective way. I'm going to recommend that we no longer rely solely on teachers' favorite novels as our core language arts curriculum, grades 6 through 9. I love novels, I like literature, I like historical fiction. I want to see those in addition to a high quality language arts curriculum at least through grades 9. After grade 9 we can do tons of things if students know how to read and write well. I'm going to shift my screening. Elementary, where I'm going to be doing repeated things called benchmarking. I'm going to shift in middle school to screening once a year. And at high school, I'm going to screen individual kids. But I have to, again, focus on end of the year data because, as we all know, once a kid's schedule is set in stone, it is set in stone. It is very difficult to change kids' schedules at middle school and high school. That's for one kid. If we have to do that for lots of kids, it doesn't work at all. I need to know that if I've got a kid that is below average in basic skills or significantly discrepant, I've got to intervene early and hard. And that means credit consequences can't drive my interventions. Yes, I can start with some electives, but if I've got a kid in 10th grade or 11th grade and I've run out of electives and the student is still an incredibly struggling reader, I need to forget the credit and give the intervention. Now, if we don't give kids what they need, they drop out. So in our quest to get kids credit, we don't give them the things they need, they're more likely to drop out. But what we need to be able to do is give parents and students a clear pathway for credit recovery. You can't ask a parent to figure it out on their own. We need to give them a prescription. I'm going to focus basic skill progress monitoring. That's what I'm providing in terms of intervention. That's what I'm going to be providing in terms of progress monitoring, but that's going to be only at tiers 2 and tier 3. The core is no longer the focus of basic skills, clearly in most middle schools and high schools. Okay, I'm going to get into number 6 here. Number 6, and it looks like number 1. Once I get into 11 and 12, I don't care about 3 tiers anymore. I'm just going to say you need an intensive intervention or you don't. If we look at reducing the amount of time, we are still screening everyone multiple times a year in high school and using it with the idea that we're going to give a science teacher 5 pages of computerized output, and that science teacher is going to look at it and say, oh, here's what I need to teach that student. That's a crazy idea. Stop it. Proactive design is going to mean that I'm going to change my eligibility process, and in particular, I need to differentiate the kids that I treat from the kids that I support. Kids with severe basic skill discrepancies may be eligible for special education intervention. Kids who are above a standard would need content area support, and I need to get better at that. Again, I'm going to change my IEP goals and progress monitoring because that will help everyone throughout the system. I'm also going to shift my related services. I can't think of the kinds of data high school psychologists would collect that would make a difference to very many people. We need to shift those services to consultation, intervention, coaching support. Okay, so I've got about 1 minute left with all of our delays. And so when I talk about lessons learned, I'm going to leave you with this. There's this huge thing. We've got to get over the bias of commercial programs. I hate it when people say, oh, that's a canned program, as if we're buying tuna or salmon. Michael Fullen, one of our heroes in terms of school improvement, says that if we want to get meaningful change, we've got to do this. We've got to make decisions about high quality teaching and training materials. That's how you get large-scale reform in the shortest period of time. We all bring expertise to the process, but we don't all bring the kinds of skills necessary for high-quality curriculum design. So I leave with this sort of general idea. We are in an era where we want all of our teachers to be either Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, and I would much prefer that our teachers are more like Yo-Yo Ma, a virtuoso performer. That give me a program, I need to know it inside outside, but let me modify it, let me be able to differentiate for those kids, and that's a really important thing for me. Okay, I'm at the 45-minute 22-second part, and there are a lot more slides that you can take a look at that will flesh out a little bit more of some of the things that I might see in terms of proactive design. But I thought that I would try to find the questions box here and see what kinds of questions people may have. I'm looking, I'm seeing polling, handouts, presenter, and let me minimize my slides. Let me go to maximizing the questions. And I see Mary, how often should CBM use to monitor progress? Does it vary for each grade? Okay, it'll go like this. So when I'm looking at a student who's below average, that's a student in my bottom quarter, there's little data to suggest that kids at Tier 2 benefit from more than once a month progress monitoring. Now, if I had resources, I would do it more than once a month. But me, I like to reproduce what's called the benchmark process. Okay? But for my Tier 2 students in intervention, I would do that monthly. Now, you can do it every other week. You can do it weekly at Tier 2 if you'd like. But for students in Tier 3 and or with special ed IEPs, it would be weekly. And those guidelines, I would use both elementary and secondary. Now, Amy asks, does 75 minutes of Tier 3 explicit skills instruction count as one core ELA credit language class for graduation? In most cases, I would argue yes. You can only go so far with some of that. But the bottom line is this. Everything we can do to get that student to be able to navigate informational text will increase the likelihood of employment. You can't be an auto mechanic if you cannot read technical manuals. And in fact, you can't be an auto mechanic if you can't manipulate fractions, and especially the decimal system. Okay? So, when we start talking about that, I would like it to be the kinds of things for graduation. Okay. Now, if I can't, I need to get into a credit recovery. So how do you respond when you know students need an intervention, but the district wants to see a focus on grade level standards, even though they can't? So there's a couple answers I have to that, and some of them are not particularly polite. So this notion about bowing to the image of the core as if it's perfect, the grade level standards are not a curriculum. Yes, we want kids to be able to do stuff like everybody else, but the farther the kids get behind, the less they learn. The farther behind they are, the harder they are to teach. The harder they are to teach, the more likely they may be disrupting other students. The more likely they're disrupting other students, it diminishes quality of school climate. But the bottom line is that they're not doing well in school, we could be creating dropouts. By design, because of our interest in that the grade level standards are the only thing. Now, they are a thing, but if a student can't achieve them, let's provide appropriately intensive intervention. Now remember, if we can get the job done at K1, 2 or K1, 2, 3, then guess what? A lot of these issues about grade level standards, I will argue, will fall by the wayside. But until we address that, we're not going to get anywhere. How do we change the existing paradigm to refocus energies on students that need intervention? Have a plan. I know it's sort of simple, but most people, when you ask them, okay, what would tiered services or RTI look like in your school or district? At best, okay, we need to do screening or benchmarking, and we need multiple tiers, usually 3. That's it. Well, what else? Well, we need to have more. Have a plan. Okay, so high priority. How do we begin changing the design? Start having a plan. Okay, Mary asks, do you see differences in the process, elementary, middle school, high school? Absolutely. Our focus shifts a lot to some kids needing intensive basic skill interventions, but more or most kids needing content area support. A high school teacher has less training in effective teaching than an elementary teacher. And elementary teachers report that their teacher ed programs didn't prepare them on how to teach. Maybe what to teach, but not how. That's a problem at secondary, and we need to focus on that. Okay, the rest of them are sort of low priority, but that's okay because I've got 8 minutes left and people can put other ones in there. Okay, let's see, how do you respond? Need intensive grade level standards. Okay, they're showing up for us. We're seeing the slides. Okay, so I think I've hit most of the questions. Now again, I'll sort of apologize for the technical difficulties here, whether it's me from my end or strange, bizarre things in the world of the internet. But I've tried to provide you some things that would be thought-provoking. There are probably another 10 more slides that give you some more specific examples and allow you to compare what I would call the things we need to do to be able to intensify our core instruction, like at Tier 1. If you're in a low-performing community, we can't just do anything we want. We need to provide students the types of instructional supports that make the likelihood of failure much lower. What a colleague of mine, Ed Kameanui, has described, we're stuck with what's called the tyranny of time. And a student who's not learning for a week, for an adult that may not be a big deal, but for a student that's a really big deal. The greater the needs of students, the more we need proven programs and leaving less to chance. I have seen low performing communities where the average teacher stay there is 3 to 5 years. They're churning students over, they're churning teachers over, and what they do need is a stable curriculum that somebody can walk in and deliver with quality. There's some of those things that you will see in the additional slides. Any other additional questions here? Any questions from our hosts? Looks like we've got about 7 minutes left of our time frame.
Come on, John. Great. Well, thanks everybody for attending today and sticking with us through the technical difficulties. There are handouts located here on your screen for a lot of the details that Mark shared today, including the remaining slides that he has in the presentation. And this presentation will be on demand for the next 90 days, and we'll be sending you a post-survey for follow-up to build future events. So thanks for participating today. Our next presenter is Dr. Nancy Marchand Martella to support information about teaching students with autism. See you then. Bye-bye.